Thank you, Professor Alfredo, for organizing this conversation among yourself, Alfredo Pereira Jr. from the State University of São Paulo. And also with us is José Montserrat Neto from the Federal University of Lavras. And also our special guest of this afternoon conversation is Mr. Gregory Nixon, which provided us with quite a few papers and articles, several topics that we are going to discuss during our conversation. I don't know if anyone would like to present yourself, Greg, something else about you.
Well, I've been a professor a long time, and before that I taught drama in high school, which probably adds to my philosophizing a nice flair, which irritates some people. I've been a professor in the United States and in Canada in 6 different universities. I got into philosophy of mind in the 90s, studying learning, which brought me to memory. And then I read memory studies and noticed all the memory studies were on conscious memory. They never delved into unconscious memory, which brought me into consciousness studies, into the whole idea. And there I encountered the big threshold of language, that human language makes a vast difference in consciousness. And the authors I read we're still calling it consciousness, that with language, humans become conscious in the psychological sense. But I wasn't comfortable with that because I happen to love animals too. And I know very much that they feel and are aware and we can communicate with them. So I worked with people like Leslie Dewart and Ernst Cassirer on language, and they tended to dismiss animal awareness a lot, but clearly animals are aware. So I began to use a term used by Dewart for non-conscious experience. But David Chalmers took care of that when he announced at one of those Tucson conferences that for the sake of convenience, we're going to equate experience and consciousness from now on. And it pretty well has become an edict throughout consciousness studies that the two are the same. I've never heard of an edict in philosophy before because everything should be investigated. But since then, that concept has gone out. So we say humans are the only ones who have self-consciousness or access consciousness. And this to me is all the result of crossing the symbolic threshold into language. A particular kind of consciousness that spans time and space, the past and the future, purposes and meanings. But then what about the others? What about the non-human animals? And that means that they experience, and then that tended to open up the question, how far does experience go down? Of what does it consist? And then I began to read Whitehead, who really is very difficult at first, but the idea is that experience is not conscious experience. It's not remembered at the most raw levels. And in that case, all cellular organisms would experience their changes. Experience is relational, which led me to Whitehead's idea of Pan-Experientialism, that in the field of matter and energy, all dynamic changes are experienced, at least momentarily, and the effects lead physically to evolution and mentally toward more complex minds. But at the raw level, experience is, according to Whitehead, a zeptosecond, a moment that passes, and as it passes, it becomes a bound energy, that is matter. And so, in a sense, White is on the verge of what Alfredo doesn't like of idealism when he says that experience itself precedes the construction of matter and formed energy by a zeptosecond. But I think it's meant to be understood that this is time itself over space. This is time itself unfolding. So it is never pure experience and never pure matter. It's always a process of unfolding. And that's Pan-Experientialism. Later on, with the addition of memory and finally a central nervous system, experience becomes extended. It becomes remembered and applied to the future. And as the nervous system evolves, the so-called combination problem is dealt with, because so does mind evolve. So experience itself is seen as fundamental, but it's not conscious experience. I can't imagine an electron making a choice of where to be as considered consciously. Words like mind and consciousness are avoided in Pan-Experientialism. I'd like to add that I'm not a believer in Pan-Experientialism or a supporter. I'm an explorer. I mean, it's very interesting and it answers a lot of questions, but as a philosopher, you don't say this is it and that's it. This is not an ideology or a belief system. It's a way of exploring until proven otherwise. That's the brief outline there. The problem, now that my mind's going, the problem is with Pan-Experientialism is that if it's identified as a metaphysic, it has no, metaphysics is about what doesn't change, what is ultimately true. And like process philosophy itself, does change. It is nothing but change. It is the process of time changing constantly and evolving, going backward and forward, stopping, speeding up. Time is what the ultimate truth is. If there's a metaphysic beyond that, you might say, well, doesn't time stop somewhere? And it does, apparently, at the speed of light. If you were light, there'd be no time. You might say there's nothing beyond the chronological process, but this nothing, as we've talked about, Alfredo, many times, is not quite what it seems. That might be a metaphysic of its own, a kind of a Mysterianism, the Mysterianism of nothingness. But I leave that to the Buddhists and to, I guess, Alan Wallace and people like that to talk about void consciousness as being the ultimate origin. But it's a something that's nothing. So not much can be said about that. I would just say that there might be something beyond and not something beyond Pan-Experientialism. There must be a core.
Question about the difference between Merleau-Ponty and Whitehead, because Merleau-Ponty also thinks that philosophy is an investigation process that doesn't find the truth.
Right.
But there is a difference in the approach, because for Merleau-Ponty, the living body is the basis for experience. But in Whitehead, is there a biological thought in Whitehead about the relation between experience and life? Well, for Merleau-Ponty and Thompson, for instance, the experience is related to life, it seems. But in Whitehead,
I think you're asking about 10 questions there, but...
Okay.
Well, Merleau-Ponty's embodiment isn't just about the human body as the source of experience. He centers on embodiment, but the body is part of the environment and is intimately connected with all bodies. So his idea of embodiment is an embrace of the very real physical universe itself. And he never denies, he talks about embodied experience without using the term consciousness. It's in French, though. Merleau-Ponty is very hard to translate into normal English because he writes paradoxically. But when he talks about the flesh of the body, he also means it's embedded in the flesh of the world. And that's a kind of Pan-Experientialism of its own. He never uses such terms, but the idea of the world flesh is a continuum of being that involves feeling and experience and matter and physical entities. Whitehead and Merleau-Ponty never met, but they apparently admired each other. And Whitehead says conscious experience. He's not very explicit on this. Experience becomes aware of itself happening only among humans and a few highly trained beasties part of the time. So he recognizes the threshold of the human too. Merleau-Ponty, I would say, probably goes deeper than Whitehead because he deals in paradox. The idea, his ontology is an intra-ontology in which everything is created by the process of exchange, interaction, and reversibility. So in a sense, though, I see the same process there in Whitehead. It's a process of interaction and exchange in which the source is unknowable, if there is one, because that puts it in time. If there's a source, it would be out of time, and therefore not much can be said about it. The idea of an eternal present is not common in Whitehead or Merleau-Ponty, but timelessness does exist in the physical universe, so it might be a concept to be considered, that there's a now space that is not the specious present, that is not simply a movement of the past into the future, a real now, which would be the void. It'd be pure potential. Nothing until experience happens to get it moving into time. And time and consciousness are certainly parallel entities, maybe even identical. I got a bit off topic there, but I just wrote a little paper on Merleau-Ponty and published it in CF, Constructive Foundations, and it was difficult to get the mind around his ideas of he's trying to be anti-metaphysical, but even that's a metaphysics. And his intra-ontology, he ended up saying, is like two mirrors facing each other. The mind and the matter.
boy. That's good image.
Yes. We recognize ourselves only by what we're not. And we are always in the process of change. I think that goes pretty deep. I wish sometimes I could read Merleau-Ponty straightened out. So he just says it, but he never does that. He avoids being pinned down. He writes a sentence that lasts a whole page, and you have to think about where he's going. But he's kind of an artist writer. In his ontology, I would say embodied experience does relate to Pan-Experientialism, but many would deny that. The flesh of the world is meant to be a feeling background to all that exists, and the very image of the flesh, palpable, reversible, you feel it on the inside and the outside, is a strong image for the unity and the disunity of being. But I can go on too much. I think the most important point and most controversial is that experience can happen non-consciously. In fact, the psychoanalysts talking about the unconscious mind are talking about experience that doesn't reach consciousness. The idea that non-conscious experience might as well not happen is not true either, because it has effects and effect. It affects consciousness constantly. It reveals itself as symptoms or as intuitions or as inspirations. Non-conscious experience is well known in our personal lives. And in a sense, though we say perhaps a non-human animal has non-conscious experience, it doesn't know that. It's feeling, it's interacting, and it's reacting according to its species. You don't see many non-human animals putting on a backpack to go find out who they are and leaving their group, because they are members of their species first and foremost. Only humans can be alienated. I guess that's not quite true. I mean, wolves can be ostracized, but they don't choose to go, I'm leaving this circle, man, I'm going to find out who I really am. They don't do that. The lone wolf is an accident. So the important point about Pan-Experientialism is that it opens the door to understanding the sources of mind in nature. I constantly am accused by scientific-minded people of dabbling in the supernatural. And if it's not scientific and it's not material, then you're looking for a God hole in philosophy, and not really. It's nature we're talking about here. Nature itself is experiencing. Maybe there's a lot of my generation tends to agree with that because in the late 60s we did experimentation in which nature very much seemed to come alive around us. So it's not beyond, it's not based in pure scientific speculation. And since nature goes all the way down into nothingness, into the nothingness between atoms, that must be experiencing too. Experience must be part of it from the very get-go. I was quite surprised to learn from Alfredo that there's an idea of an energy at the ultimate level of being that is not bound into matter, but capital E energy, as you put it. I rather like that idea of associating that with the void, with what do they call that? The quantum vacuum or the quantum foam, which isn't even existing because it has no time and it has no space. It's all potential. But apparently they say 1 cubic centimeter of energy is as much energy as our whole galaxy. I don't know how you can equate potential energy with real energy, but that gets pretty metaphysical in that whole idea. And I've had people say, well, you believe in Pan-Experientialism? Well, not really. I've changed a lot. I listen and learn. I'll defend it because I'm learning about it, but it's not a thing, is it? It's just a perspective. It's a way of understanding things better. That I like what Beatball wrote, Michel Beatball in Constructivist Foundations, that trying to understand experientially the nature of reality gives you more than abstract knowledge. The understanding should lead to a change in the researcher. Experiential understanding leads to new experiences. It's a different idea of learning, and I think that's very important, that those who are open to experience being a part of nature experience themselves very differently, and they tend to wake up a bit. And if you study nature as you leave mind out of nature and study it only objectively, that's all you're going to get out of it is data. It won't mean a thing except on paper. And to bring meaning into things, I think we need to open it up to phenomenology and the experience of study itself. That should be quite well known. I know Alfredo agrees with that.
We mostly agree. There are some terminological issues, but I will not bother you with them. But with this theoretical pathway you described, then we reach our paper, Consciousness and Cosmos, that appeared in Journal of Consciousness Studies, and was the motivation for this interview, because Augusto is investigating with the 4 authors our different ways of approaching this issue of consciousness in the cosmos. And Augusto prepared some questions for our discussion. So I'll let Augusto make the questions. And if Monserrat also wants to make comments and questions, please raise the hand.
Okay.
Okay.
Can I just ask Augusto? So you read some of my stuff?
Yes, I read the 5 articles, but yes, I did. Yes.
Was it clear? Was it clear? I try to write.
Yes, very clear.
Not to be tricky, not to be obscure, but really say things out in the open. Good. Oh yes, Jose, you had a question.
No.
Yes.
Augusto. Augusto.
Okay. So, Greg, the first article that you made available to us was related to the mythic consciousness or the mythic mind. In your article, you mentioned that the mythic mind is not aware of isolation. Consciousness, according to your article, is a collective phenomenon rather than an individual isolated phenomenon. And at a certain point in time, this collective consciousness, which is mythical, at sudden acquires the human beings that are involved in this mythical collective consciousness. They acquire language. They acquire the ability to communicate through language. Either verbal, writing, and this sort of inflates the individual self, right? I'd like to make a connection between, sort of. I'd like to make a connection between a mental condition or a mental disease, which is very popular at the end of last century and beginning of our century as well, which is called intermittent explosive disorder. I don't know if you know, Greg, intermittent explosive disorder is an impulse control disorder characterized by sudden episodes of unwarranted anger. The disorder is typified by hostility, impulsivity, and recurrent aggressive outbursts. People with intermittent explosive disorder explode into a rage despite a lack of apparent provocation or reason.
Now, in the Victoria era, I can understand that. A lot of repression.
Yes, you mentioned in your article that the act of killing, the act of causing death, and feeling horror is the breakthrough into a qualitative new dimension of the mind and soul and consciousness.
Yes. That wasn't me though. That's Gregory.
Right. Is it possible to say that those people, and I'm talking about 17 million people only in United States of America, which suffer from this disease? Is it accurate? Is it possible to say that this sort of disease, apart from the biological, chemical conditions of an individual, is also based on an attempt to belong to a certain community, because we are isolated individuals. We lack the sense of belonging to a community. So these outbursts of rage and anger
and hysteria, very common.
Is it something that you could say that those people are crying for help? They're trying to say, look, I'm here. I want to belong to this community. Yeah. I'm feeling strange. I'm feeling orphaned. How can you take care of me?
That's a hell of a question. That's a big one. But the hysteria and the sense of lack of joining may be indeed part of it, but it's a big question. According to the ideas of Gregory, if I can just go back a little earlier, mythic mind is the first stage of conscious mind. So mythic doesn't precede consciousness; it precedes analysis. The mythic consciousness is combined. True, it's ritualistic, and what Gregory writes about is that when we became conscious because of symbolic activity, we became aware that we killed to live. And like the hippies and vegans today, that caused great shock. But we had to go on doing it anyway to live. And so as we got into planting cultures, we didn't hunt quite so much. Sacrifice of animals, humans, and grains became the order of the day to shock and combine the groups into being one again, to unite them in the horrific and exciting experience of being one with the gods. If you want to relate that to the moments of madness and hysteria because people are lacking a ritual bond, that could well be, but it could easily just be isolation and frustration in such a rule-bound society that people are emotionally tangled up and wrecked. I mean, people, the women were, especially not the working women, the middle-class women were having breakdowns of hysteria quite commonly in that time. She can't cope. Well, she can't cope because she's not allowed to participate. So she breaks down. This kind of thing does go way back in time to mythic culture, as we say. These are the stages of Merlin Donald. That as non-human animals, we lived in an episodic culture, an eternal present. And then as we got into symbolic exchange in dance, movement, music, and language, we began to need myths and rituals, and we became identified as a certain tribe or a certain group with a certain metaphysics, that is, gods above. We built a worldview. There was no idea of an individual. And as Eliade has shown, the very idea of being an individual was what many of the myths are all about. Do not do this. Do not isolate yourself from the gods or from the group. Even Greek tragedy teaches the lesson of trying to test fate. You must be part of the group, but still individuality would emerge, at least among the merchant class, because being a self means selfishness. And that's what began to happen. The fall from myth into reason. What's more reasonable than personal gain is what occurred into analytic culture and capitalism. The two movements are combined, and they do create individuals and self-seeking. And many of us people who are really nice inside get fooled by these people all the time because they pretend to be altruistic and kind, but they're really just using you. And at the time of that you're mentioning of the industrial era, self-seeking and individualism without regard to the environment or the poor or any of that was commonplace. It was running rampant. I would expect there would have been a great deal of guilt in the people that were participating in this, and that guilt could have led to all the kinds of breakdowns that and it's still happening today too. People are not happy just fitting in; they want to break out, and it could well be because we are very isolated, and some of us have rather adapted to that, but we still try to make extra personal connections like we're doing here across the Western world. That's kind of a big answer to your question, but I would think that the fall into individuality has led to all kinds of psychological trauma, narcissism being one that was talked about a lot in the 80s and 90s, and Donald Trump and that kind of thing. And your Brazilian president is kind of narcissistic himself, pardon me.
Very much, very much.
So the idea of myth in the background is really interesting to me. It's part of it because you can't escape it. Myth is the worldview assumptions behind our reasoning. It's always present. You don't have to believe in many gods to be living in a mythic world. It's the unrecognized assumptions by which we live. And they're very hard to escape. But you can change your myth. You can change your worldview. It's very radical. A crisis can help.
Yeah, I think our science, the institutional of our science today, is a sort of mythic We
Yeah.
believe in many things that are somehow we don't explain. You just believe.
If you've ever argued with a scientist or a scientific supporter, you'll see immediately how tightly wound they are, how protective of their worldview they are. If you don't have empirical evidence, you're saying bullshit, and that's it. They won't go any further. They completely ignore experience. So what you're talking about, I understand, is the ideology of science, the belief system, which is called scientism, and a word that scientists hate, because scientism is not the experimental method that is constantly adapting itself. It's the belief system, the ideology that says only material, physical, mathematical truths count. Nothing else does. They totally ignore the fact that all this scientific knowledge would not be possible without conscious experience in the first place. They isolate a non-experienced world to study it, and then look for mind in that non-experienced world. Now, if that's not bizarre, I don't know what is. Yes. So killing is so killing. I don't know how true that is, but I understand. I've always been fascinated by the need for ritual in ancient cultures, and which keeps emerging in crowds and in groups. It's obvious in our sports, in our pornography. There's ritualized activities in all these things, which you can see very plainly if you blink and recognize what's going on. Okay?
Alfredo would like to make any comment, or
this part of Greg's work, I did not discuss with him before, or I did not acknowledge. But it's important. Messiah Eliade is an important author in this for this interpretation of culture and the role of myth in culture.
Very important.
Yes, I think this is very relevant for the discussion of culture today. So I'm learning from you here.
Yeah, he's been very criticized because apparently he has some fascism in his background in Romania, but that wasn't part of his later scholarship. What he taught me and what he really shocked me with his revelations was that early human cultures were immersed in the sacred. The sacred wasn't just like going to church an alternative. In my view, as in Myth and Mind, that paper, when people through symbolism began to talk about their origins, to see the rituals that they were doing, when they became aware of the long ago, the far away, the yet to come, this was the sacred. The sacred I'm not relating to spiritual necessarily, but to the awakening of the mind to beyond the senses. Awakening to the sacred means that there was an origin, that we have a purpose, that there is existence far away and high up in the sky and down below the ground. We can now live in the palaces of imagination. We are freed from our bondage to the immediate. And the sacred is the huge world that they began to live in. And they, as Walter Otto said, they must have walked about in awe and terror, realizing this world is so much more than is revealed. Another part of the sacred is the invisible but present. The idea that there are invisible presences among us, especially the ancestors and the gods and the demons. So they lived in this world and were both alert and fearful and very much probably more alive than we feel on a daily basis. The history of humanity is about this sort of fall from the sacred, what I call the sacred, into daily life, into mundane realism, which is not a bad thing, I know, but the realism of science today teaches us about the long ago and the far away and the yet to come. but it's no longer got the sacred attached to it. It's now become worldly. We are still living in the same world our ancestors woke up to, but now it's knowledge, and it's not inspiring necessarily, although when you read about deep space and quantum physics, it is pretty inspiring. But the fall from grace is common in many mythic systems. There was a time, as Eliade wrote, in Elid Tempest, when we walked among the gods, when all things were possible. But we fell from that when we became selves and became concerned for daily things. And we had to go east of Eden and give birth in pain and work the toil of our hands. That seems to be a giant metaphor for what happened to us. We lost the sense of attachment to nature and each other, and are working our way through a world by explanations. Objectivity sickness is probably what's driving us mad as anything.
But is there the danger of trying to understand the consciousness without science? We have two opposites. One is trying to limit knowledge to science, and the other one may be ignoring
To
science.
escape science, yeah.
As in the case of the Brazilian government, COVID treatments that are not based on science, and they don't work.
Yeah, I have many friends who move into the mystical and ideas and condemn science as an illusion. It's all just made up from the mind, and I can't follow them there. The physical world is real. There's no doubt about it, and we are immersed in it. I just think there's more to it than we generally assume. There's more to it in terms of experience. It's alive. Everything's alive. But I quite agree that the movement toward anti-science and movement away from knowledge is anarchistic. It's atavistic, and it's a mistake. I would never want to transcend life too early or be unworldly because there's so much here of interest. What we're looking for, I think, is a combination of experience and the external, the internal and the external becoming one, as Merleau-Ponty said. And he respected science too, although it sometimes wasn't returned. It's a lot of the lower level sciences that are very hostile to anyone who conjectures about subjective experience playing a role in the unfolding of events, which is just nuts, because of course it does. But I quite agree with you, Alfredo, that the knowledge we have gained through objective study is important and useful. It just may have more to it. We should not reject science, no. Matter of fact, even most scientists reject quantum physics and things like that, which throw in their classical views into question. So science opens a lot of doors, there's no doubt about it. I can't do much myself because I can't do the math, but I love reading the theories. I suppose we're all involved in science in some way. Is the truth transcendent, or is the truth immanent? Or is there no truth? Got me there.
Let me make a question. Your approach is very interesting. I always complained because you put in the you stress the threshold of symbolic transition. This transition is fundamental for what we are nowadays, humans. And this transition is something very polemic. There are many approaches about this. Your approach is one of them. But there are other people, other scientists. For example, Steve Mithen. I think it's in English, Stephen Mithen, I think. You know, and there is also Marilyn Donald in I think American.
I just mentioned him. He's Canadian.
He's Canadian. Oh, I didn't know. Okay. And many others. And there are a lot of polemics about this transition. How you put yourself in this area, in this polemics, I would say. For example, there is one I like very much, is Terence Deacon in his approach about this transition from symbolic, from earlier humans or hominids to humans, also stressing the symbolic transition, the role of rituals, music, and also very similar or very next to your approach. How do
Terence Deacon used that? He wasn't first, but he used the phrase "the symbolic threshold." Across the symbolic threshold, everything changes.
Yeah, and so how you put yourself in this polemics around this different approaches, if you have some position, clear or not?
Well, I'm in a minority these days. No surprise. There's scientific styles or paradigms, and the paradigm recently has been integration and inclusivity, and putting down of the old ways, the mainstream, so-called white male Eurocentric thinking. And what happens with that is that we tend to ignore things that are obviously true. Most people are convinced that humans are just another animal, and we certainly are. But as any visitor from outer space would soon see, we are a very different animal. We're everywhere, in all environments. And the Neanderthals were geniuses. I mean, we've been putting them down way too long, but the facts don't bear that out. There's very little symbolic activity that has been suggested for the Neanderthal, a very powerful creature. I'm 2.2% apparently, but there's no proof that Neanderthals really used symbols in the way that Homo sapiens did. And there's no proof of any non-human animals using language for conversation. We have trained a lot of beasties, like bonobo and stuff, to press symbols, but it's usually for things I want. They haven't really crossed the symbolic threshold into talking about the weather, into making conversation, into building a world. Where are their works? I mean, I love animals, as I said, but I've been told by so many people that animals have a language just as complex as ours. Sorry for talking so fast. What they have is very complex signaling systems that are more complex than ours. But a language isn't just a signaling system. It's a conversation, a mode of thought. It leads to human thinking, and signaling doesn't lead to conceptual thinking. Humans are unique, unpopular as that may be right now. And Cro-Magnon artworks in caves in France are unparalleled anywhere in the world, no matter how many times they find a scratch here and there that can be compared to it. So in your talk about styles or paradigms, I think there are some very strong ones. There's some people going just the opposite way, very much pro-tradition. But I think recognizing differences needs to be disciplined and taken seriously. The fact that humans are a unique animal is just not disputable. It doesn't mean we're superior. We're probably the most dangerous animal to the planet that there is. Well, we are. We in COVID. And so we're not necessarily better, but we are certainly different. And the difference is symbolism. And symbolism has changed everything. We live in a world of religion and music, thought, dreams, works and building. We run amok. Our population has unbalanced nature.
Fake news as well.
Pardon?
An atmosphere of fake news as well as an accomplishment of humans, of top accomplishment.
Which is very hard to deal with because you don't want a narrow view of what's news and what's true as being restricted, because then that cuts out divergent thought. But when divergent thought runs amok and ignores facts, that's pretty scary too. So it's a tough thing to deal with, this need of people that I can't understand to oppose the primary narrative. Sometimes it's good and it's fun and it's important and it's exhilarating, but some people seem to oppose it just because it's there. You know, like, we should fight this world plague. No, we shouldn't. It's all fake. There's going to be people saying that just because they're told not to. I don't really understand that. Maybe it's because I'm no longer 18, but there are alternative narratives happening, and some of them are embraced. And I'm pretty sure the reason for these absurdities is because they feel good. They cause adrenaline. I'm in on a secret. I know something, you know, that no one else knows. And people will strongly support those kinds of ideas. But I think you can, you know, checking all sorts of evidence, not necessarily just empirical, but psychological evidence, really helps keep us thinking more properly, being cautious and skeptical. I'm a strong supporter of critical thinking, which people don't really realize what it is. They use the term. Science has taken over the term critical thinking to mean more thinking, being more analytical. But as I understand it, critical thinking means questioning your own assumptions, a high tolerance for ambiguity, a willingness to change your mind, a willingness to listen to other viewpoints and try and understand them, not agree with them, but try and understand where they're coming from. This is all critical thinking. Change your perspective. It's very hard to do, actually. It's much more fun to just believe and back it up. But to question yourself is key here, and to try and be empathetic. I fail constantly to try and understand points of view that are really annoying to me. I try to understand them, but I can't see where they're coming from sometimes. Some of these people you mentioned, like the wild conspiracy theorists, I don't see a grain of truth that it starts from. So that's confusing. I'm going on a lot, I'm sorry.
Don't mind. Just to start my question, how you put yourself in this polemics? How you see, for example, the born of symbolic capacity would be very earlier in the human history, or would be like Stephen Mithen about 100,000 years ago, something like this, with a late development. Now, the culture would be a process just right after this symbolic capacity of language capacity.
That's a lovely question.
Yeah, I think it's out of question. Deacon, on the other side, his idea is it started very early, around 2,000 million years ago, with rituals, and little by little, these rituals could turn to a species, a type of language, a mimic language, and a body language, and then after some 100,000 years would be to turn into language as we know now. This is a second approach. That's why I ask you how you put yourself in this polemics.
Well, I don't think ritual as a psychological need was discovered that early. Something like coordinated movement, that's an extraordinary thing you don't see among animals, except when they do it unconsciously. But doing it consciously, as in a dance or movement, would lead to the idea that we can do things to change things. We can deal with the magic forces. But since you're asking my view, I agree that, have you heard of Derek Bickerton? He's quite
Yes.
famous in language and a great writer, very, very, very entertaining. But he's the one who noted that uh, people brought up, pardon my PC incorrect, deaf and dumb, mute and unable to hear, form at first their own gestural language, a proto-language, a gestural pointing language, and same with kids brought up in isolation. And that becomes when they meet a kind of Creole, a kind of pidgin, where they combine terms and gestures so they can communicate. But then that becomes a Creole within 2 generations. A Creole is a mixed language, but it's a real language. It has all the features of language. And it's also Bickerton who used the term proto-language. Way back at the beginning of humanity, before, like among Australopithecine even, well, a little later, Homo habilis, when we began using stone tools, they had to be a way to communicate the passing on of that template. There's no signs of fire until about 500,000 years ago, and they're probably opportunistic. But proto-language, a gestural pointing language in the immediate present. You can't talk about the past, but you can point a way out, like where to hide in a hunting trip or something. Proto-language seems to have carried on millions of years during our tool-making episodes, with very, very little change in the way tools are made, very little change in the way people live, right up until H. erectus, who apparently built boats and stuff. So this isn't language, and it's barely, in my sense, I would say it's not symbolic. It's indicative, it's gestural, but it's not symbolic to represent something that cannot be seen or heard or tasted or smelled. It's not symbolic in the abstract sense, and nor is it self-referential. You can't use language to discover that you exist. I exist. You have to have a concept of yourself to do that. So definitely early hominids did have better systems of communication that involved something like a mind to pass on those templates, to communicate where to live, probably to share hunting and gathering skills. But there's no signs of art really, except in, there's lots of anomalies. But what's an anomaly? An anomaly is where something appears and then isn't followed up on. It disappears. It's a breakthrough that comes in time. And there are those, although our knowledge is very incomplete in prehistoric research. But the first signs of actual symbolic use, I agree with Stephen Mitten there, are not until after 100,000 years ago, when the real changes suddenly appeared. And H. sapiens, our species, has been around about 200,000 years. So the first 100,000 years were kind of, even their skull was shaped differently then. They had almost no prefrontal cortex. So they were developing and they were doing improvement, but they hadn't crossed Deacon's symbolic threshold yet, which would have taken place within the last 100,000 years. There were spots of development, some anomalies there too, but not until about, well, maybe to be generous, 70,000 years ago in South Africa are the first signs of symbolic activity. But I still kind of agree that the greatest breakthrough clearly appeared in Southern Europe and in Indonesia. It's been discovered now, strangely. So they're parallel developments, as they couldn't have been connected. They're parallel developments, so the mind must have been developing in different places, multi-regional to some extent. The symbolic threshold probably wasn't crossed until about 70,000 years ago. And of course, that's going to change in the next, with further discoveries. They're constantly making new ones. But the real changes changed everything. They suddenly, and it's very suddenly, sculptured items, cave paintings, decorative jewels, different patterns of living. And they found that in the beginning of the Neolithic, these hunter-gatherers would gather at huge ritual sites. The most famous being the stone temples in Britain, but Gobel Tempike or something was a city that's been discovered about 10, 15,000 years old, but it wasn't lived in. It was a ritual center for prehistoric hunters and gatherers. So they were clearly living a symbolic life by that time. So I'm with those who say late, the late crossing of the threshold. Ian Tattersall makes one of the best arguments for that. And I don't think that's being Eurocentric, because early cave paintings have been found in Australia and in South America, in Peru, a cave about 12,000 years ago, which is not a cave, a cliff face, which is true, breaks all predictions. Wow. Coffee's hitting me.
Thank you, Greg.
Yeah. So there's kind of all implied.
Yeah. Alfredo and Augusto and Greg, I have another meeting now. It's at 4:00 here in Brazil. And so I'm sorry I have to leave this nice conversation. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for your participation.
Arrivederci.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Adios.
Bye-bye.
Augusto, do you have a question about the paper, Consciousness and Cosmos?
Yes. I have another question about the definition of intersubjective brains or intersubjective minds. According to the article, Professor Greg Nixon states that we are not born with knowledge. We must interact with others and the world to learn to perceive and understand what's perceived through our senses. Considering that Greg mentioned Buddhism and also shamanism in his articles, my understanding is that those ways of thinking, Buddhism and shamanism, have a slight different opinion than Professor Greg. Instead of saying we are not born with knowledge, considering that they believe in reincarnation, we do have a certain knowledge, even after we are born, knowledge of past lives, what they call samskaras. Samskaras are tiny remembrances of past lives, which also have a role or influence in our current lives and future lives through the law of karma. So I don't know what's, and that's my question. What's Greg's opinion? If we combine Greg's view on the intersubjective brain, which is the interaction of myself with outer selves, combining with my interaction with myself and my other selves from past and even future. If you want to play with the arrow of time, we can say that, and some Vedic scholars, some Indian scholars say that it's possible to interact with 3 future selves. And the purpose of interacting with past selves and future selves is to realize that we're no self, or we are not individual selves. We are collective. Our nature is collective. It's the individual self is an illusion. So my question for you, Professor Greg, is if reincarnation and past lives would have any possible role in your intersubjective brain theory?
No, it goes beyond my area of speculation. But you asked about three questions there. I'm going to try to combine them. I kind of am with Evan Thompson, who considers himself a Buddhist and not a Buddhist, who says those are speculative theories, only individual claims that no one can ever know about other selves, previous lives. It makes no sense to me that this body or this person could have been somebody else, because a different body means a different person. In a larger sense, of course, they all share a source. In the intersubjective thing, let me start there, go to shamanism, and then reply to your question on other selves and lives. Intersubjectivity as a primary intersubjectivity is identical to primary empathy. That is, as a newborn, we feel with our primary caregivers. We identify with them, which was certainly true in the womb as well. Your feelings on your mothers are one. So primary empathy means that you are born experiencing the consciousness, the awareness of other people secondhand. Your identity is with them. So those scientific, cognitive scientists who say we need a theory of mind to believe other people have minds. We need to watch how they behave and then infer that they have minds because they behave how I would behave if I was feeling like that. Those are unnecessary if primary intersubjectivity is true. We begin by identifying with others. Then we mimic them. And from their perspective, we learn who we are. Intersubjectivity then precedes subjectivity. Our experience has already brought us in contact with other minds before we learn to be an individual self. We don't need a theory of mind or mind reading to believe other people have minds, because we began by experiencing that. Way back in time, that's the same thing as what I was calling tribal identity. We begin by identifying with members of our immediate group and our immediate caregivers. You bring in shamanism. Now there's a bizarre switch that may have been something to do with psychedelic plants, but the shaman was, of course, an individual who was never lived in the village, but on the edge of the village, beyond the boundary, because the shaman was part of the group, but not part of the group. Probably the first individual, but not selfish exactly. Well, somewhere, of course. But the shaman sought visions, went to other worlds to come back and help others, or there's negative shamans too, according to Eliade, self-seeking one. So shamanism was the beginning of the religious quest. But when you bring in things like Tibetan Buddhism, certainly we began with a blank consciousness, void consciousness. But to say that we have been other beings or experienced other personalities can only be speculation. It's a belief system, because how could you ever demonstrate that? There have been a few claims, but even the Dalai Lama says he hasn't experienced it himself, although he has a belief system that says he's born of a whole series of Dalai Lamas. I don't see how you can include intersubjectivity with other subjects, with other selves, with other existing selves, with the selves you meet in books, with the selves as ideas, with the multiple personalities within ourselves. Absolutely, and they're very real too. But speculating, when I get into the realms of reincarnation, that goes beyond where I'm willing to go, because not that I'm denying it, I just know nothing about it. And it doesn't seem very likely, since I am, as Merleau-Ponty has identified, I am very much identified with this body, with this environment, with the other bodies I've met, with the earth. And I have no doubt that when this body dies, I who am speaking will die. because I am a creation of this environment. I learned who I was in life. So when life ends, I won't continue to exist. Having said that, though, I wouldn't exist if there were not some sort of psychic energy that brought me forth. And I don't think that's an identity. It's like the electricity that is necessary to light up a light bulb. When the bulb dies, the light goes out. But the electricity doesn't die. It's invisible and carries on. In that sense, it's related to reincarnation in that it may light up other light bulbs. And it's eternal. But that's just pure speculation. I think my awareness or the energy of my psyche will carry on. And because it's never been anywhere else. It's permanent. It's part of the universe. That's why I'm a panpsychist of sorts. But me, this self, this ego, Greg Nixon, he dies. Pip. That's it. Sorry if I've never been able to believe too much, to like say I believe it. I'm always interested. I've read the Tibetan Book of the Dead and things like that, and Evans Weitz, and it's all very interesting, but I can't deal with it on a personal level. I have many selves inside of me who have personalities of their own, but I don't think they were, from other lives. They're just different complexes and ways of seeing and being. They're like other aspects of the same person. Well, they're other persons within the same being. Does that help? Did I answer your question at all? You touched a nerve with the intersubjectivity thing because...
Yes. While you were responding my question, I was thinking about myself, my question. The promise that we identify consciousness with the body. Even if we are idealistics, we tend to identify consciousness with the body. So we can say that it's sort of, let's put it that way, the same consciousness when I am 1 year old and when I am 45 years old. But it's hard for us to think about that, not our body. When I talk about reincarnation, I'm talking about the continuity of the same consciousness, perhaps in different bodies. So I have consciousness that nowadays it's mine. It was the consciousness of a prior self, prior from my birth. And it will be the same consciousness after die. And it's the same speculation as Plato. Plato had the same speculation. The ethics proposed by Plato was an ethic that doesn't begin with our birth and doesn't end with our death. It continues.
Although he admitted he was speculating. Yes, he has the myth of that we know all before we're born and then we die, and through anamnesis we remember what we knew. I understand that.
Right.
I don't think consciousness is just the body, though. I mean, that without it, it's hard to imagine we'd be consciousness. But because we have speech, we are all part of each other, as I quoted from the linguist who says that speech and communication and symbol systems are like extensions of our brain to imperfect dendrites and axons that connect us to all other people. And if we don't have that early, we will never be a person, judging by the feral or isolated children that have been brought up, or the wonderful case of Helen Keller, who rediscovered language at about 9 years old and suddenly woke up to being conscious. If we don't connect to others early on, we will not become a person. But once we do, by adolescence, we could lose all contact with people and still remain intersubjectively consciousness because we have interiorized them. People are inside of us now. We talk to ourselves all the time, which is not a monologue. It's actually a dialogue. We imagine a listener and we imagine a speaker. So we're never alone once we've crossed that threshold. You can meditate and become alone.
I think Buddhist, but also several Indian religious traditions, what they sustain is that there's no individual consciousness. It's all. I mean, from the ontological point of view, there's only collective consciousness. So myself now, I mean, right here, right now, is an illusion. This is an illusion.
Yeah.
So if you want, I mean, if you want to go far beyond what you mentioned by collective consciousness or mythic consciousness, perhaps if you consider not the reincarnation of the body, but the continuity of the consciousness. I mean, the word, the masses is
I
a
can't
Greek
imagine
word.
consciousness without a grounding, without a physical grounding.
Okay, I see.
But what you're saying, though, the world itself is considered to be an illusion to those belief systems. And in some sense, even science shows us it probably is. If you look at a table, it's a table. But if you look into the table a lot more closely, it's 99.9 empty space. It's an illusion, the table. Everything's an illusion, but it's still a lived reality. My individuality may be an illusion cosmically, but it's one I live. It's real to me. And as many writers in the West, I remember even Kerouac declaring, if I'm an illusion, I'm the most important illusion I have. Being an individual and becoming more of an individual may be an illusion, but it's a very important one. To avoid being swept away by others, to avoid being absorbed by other viewpoints, we must make an effort to recognize our own individuality, even if it is ultimately an illusion. The flame of a candle is part of all flames, but it's still that candle at a particular time and place. So what I'm saying is just because things are illusions on the grand scale doesn't mean in fact, we must live them as real. The world is real because I'm living in it. My body is real. My identity is real. Even if they're ultimately illusions, they're my lived reality, as phenomenology puts it. So you can pull the veil away and reveal too much, but sometimes when you're dealt a hand, it's best to play the hand and not say, it's just a game, I'm not going to play it. You play it anyway. That's the game of life. You're playing it because you're there. You've been thrown into life. It's like waking in a dream. You don't know how you got there or what you're doing, but you immediately try to understand your surroundings and you play the game. The grand game of life. So I, illusion and illusion. It might be all illusion and really nothing in the ultimate state, but that doesn't matter. We're here. We have to live it. That's what I'm trying to do anyway.
Alfredo would like to make any comment?
Yes. Professor Greg, from your experience at the universities you said you worked in 6 universities. Do you think there is space, there is room for the theory of consciousness in the curriculum as a discipline it's unlikely to be a profession?
Consciousness studies.
Consciousness researcher.
At the last university I was at, a small one, the University of Northern British Columbia, they didn't even have a philosophy department. That was taken care of by members of computer science and psychology. And I contacted them and got to teach a few courses, but they weren't happy with my approach, which was not based in brain function. You know, I've taught courses in consciousness studies, but it's such an open field. I waste a lot of time going on to Facebook on the consciousness studies group, the Pan-Psychist group, even one on the psychedelic and mind group. And wow, the viewpoints are spread all over, but there is a great divide between the reductivists and those who are more open to other sources of consciousness. If you look for consciousness beyond the brain, it doesn't mean you're looking for God, which these people assume. It might for some people, but I don't see that. I think you're looking for the electricity that made the light bulb possible. You're looking for nature. Young people, I think, are very interested in consciousness studies today because of the fuss, first caused by AI in the 90s. I'm writing a paper on that now. And then on the hard problem stuff. Word is spread that there's one thing science can't explain, which scientists don't believe, but many of us do. It can't explain the overwhelming predominance and presence of the conscious mind in this physical, unconscious universe. And so young people have become interested, and many are looking for a God-sized whole, you know. But I think that's a mistake. I think it should be natural. I don't think there's going to be a Department of Consciousness Studies anytime soon, except within each department. Psychology, as you know, as I'm sure you know, is no longer a theoretical science. Well, it's a science. They don't discuss psychological theory. It's not allowed anymore. Only experiments. So the trend has been, it's still that war, but the brain-centered people are definitely winning the war in the media, at least. You know, that's why we have our own little world where we can do our philosophy and talk to each other. Keeps us alive.
In society, there are some worries about economic sanitary crisis, and there are some efforts to think about social consciousness as a remedy. Raising our consciousness in society could help to avoid this type of problem. Do you think, is there a role for this social consciousness in economy and politics, or maybe bioethics?
Well, I suppose that kind of goes, when we get into values and economics and stuff, that goes beyond my expertise. Certainly a change of mind is needed for the human populace in general to think beyond themselves, to avoid the prison hold of self-centeredness and greed, which is destroying the planet and probably all our relationships. Why do we elect the worst kind of people into politics constantly? Certainly not the brightest. There's something wrong, but I don't know where the cure lies. People talk about mindfulness or trust groups, and I don't know. I may live alone for a reason because I haven't been all that socially successful, I guess. I don't know how to cure us, Alfredo. I wish I did. But certainly I have found thinking people who are not absent-minded but are open-minded, really could change the world. And they're the ones. And there are many among the young people. The danger among the young is that they get so doctrinaire very quickly. They get excited about ideas and they no longer question whether they're true. They're just true. And if you disagree, well, you're wrong. But I think there's a hope for the world in the long run if we if we're willing to become open-minded thinking beings, you know, and I guess that means caring. I'm not much of a social philosopher, but things like, you know, economically, socialism makes a great deal of sense. But you can't really have socialism in one nation in a capitalist world. You need international socialism. But at the same time, on the social level, on the personal freedom level, I'm something like a libertarian. If nobody's being heard, it should be allowed. That's kind of an old hippie thought, you know. You do your own thing, and if it doesn't bother anybody, fine. But economically, we shouldn't let the corporations run the world and run governments anymore. We should control the economy, take our minds out of our pockets, tax the rich, that kind of thing. Okay, gentlemen? Have we covered it all?
Yes, yes. Well, thank you very much. Augusto, would you like to make closing comments? And
No. Actually, I just appreciate your time, your availability, Professor Greg. Thank you for your articles. They're very inspiring, very inspiring. I enjoyed a lot, more than not only learning, but also enjoying what I was reading. It was very...
That's what I want to hear.
Yeah. Right.
That's what reading a paper should be like. It should be a fun exploration, not just a matter of I agree or don't agree. And you understood it, so that's really good, because that's how I want to write.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed this too. See you around, Alfredo. See you.
And I would like to say that I learned about Pan-Experientialism with you. It was not in my formation. So you were my teacher of Pan-Experientialism.
Well, I taught the great man something then.
Okay.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Sayonara.
Sayonara.